Before the pyramids, before hieroglyphs, before Egypt became Egypt, there was a king whose name was feared more than the gods. He wore two crowns that were never meant to be worn together. He ended centuries of bloodshed in a single lifetime. And then, according to legend, he vanished. No heroic death, no clear tomb, only silence. Tonight, we uncover the story of the first pharaoh who united Egypt and why ancient history quietly suggests he paid for it with his life. Stay with me, because this story ends where most myths begin to lie. This is beyond time. Before unification, Egypt was fragile. Archaeology tells a brutal story. Burned settlements, mass graves, weapons buried with elites. This was not a peaceful land waiting to unite. It was a battlefield stretched along the Nile. Each side believed the gods were on their side. Each side believed the other was chaos. Unification wasn't destiny, it was a gamble. And whoever attempted it would make enemies powerful enough to erase them from history. The attack came at dawn. Mist clung to the Nile as warriors moved silently through the reeds. Stone maces, flint blades, bare feet in wet mud. By the time the sun rose, the village was burning. Bodies lay along the riverbank, some bound, some broken, some floating slowly downstream. The Nile, the giver of life, carried the dead south and north alike. This was Egypt before Egypt. No pharaoh, no unified crown, only survival. For centuries, the Nile did not unite the land, it divided it. Upper Egypt in the south was hard and militant, shaped by deserts and cliffs. Lower Egypt in the north was rich, crowded, and politically sophisticated, fed by trade and fertile soil. Each side believed the gods favored them. Each side believed the other was disorder. And both were right. Archaeology reveals a forgotten truth. This era was soaked in violence. Fortified towns, mass graves, weapons buried with elites, not as symbols, but as necessities. These were not ceremonial conflicts. They were wars of extinction. Every local ruler who rose too high was hunted. Every alliance was temporary. Every victory created new enemies. Unification was not an idea anyone welcomed, because unification meant only one thing. Someone would lose everything. And anyone who tried to unite the two lands would instantly become the most hated man in Egypt. Yet out of this chaos, one warlord rose higher than the rest. Not because he was merciful, but because he was ruthless enough to finish what others couldn't. He didn't promise peace, he promised dominance. And the Nile, stained with blood, carried whispers of his name long before history carved it in stone. Narmer was coming, and Egypt would never be the same again. No one knows what Narmer looked like. There are no portraits, no personal words, no recorded thoughts, only images, carefully chosen ones. Carved into stone, Narmer appears larger than everyone around him, not just taller, but dominant. A man scaled like a god among mortals. This was not art, it was a warning. The most important image comes from a single object, the Narmer palette. On one side, Narmer raises his mace above a kneeling enemy. The pose is timeless, repeated by Egyptian pharaohs for thousands of years. But Narmer was the first. He wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, the crown of conquest. Turn the palette over, and everything changes. Narmer now wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, the crown of rule. This wasn't decoration, it was a declaration carved in stone. I am king of both worlds. And that claim was revolutionary. Before Narmer, kings ruled regions. After Narmer, a king ruled Egypt. But symbols have consequences. By placing himself above all rivals, Narmer erased the old balance of power. Local rulers became subjects, priests became dependent, generals became expendable. Every crown he wore created loyalty and resentment. Because when one man claims everything, everyone else loses something. And in the shadows of his rising power, enemies were already learning a dangerous lesson. If Narmer could be made king by violence, he could be removed the same way. The crowns unified Egypt, but they also marked him. Unification did not come through diplomacy, it came through force. Armies moved along the Nile, using the river as both road and weapon. Boats carried warriors south and north, striking settlements before warnings could spread. There were no rules of engagement, no surrender terms. Cities that resisted were erased. Archaeology confirms what the texts only hint at: skulls crushed by maces, walls torn down, bodies buried in mass graves. Narmer's campaign was systematic. First rival kings, then their families, then the symbols that gave them legitimacy. Standards were broken, totems destroyed, names scratched out. In ancient Egypt, to erase a name was to destroy a soul. This was not conquest alone, it was psychological warfare. By the time Narmer reached the Delta, resistance collapsed, not because he was merciful, but because he was inevitable. The two lands were united. But unity came with a cost. The old order was dead, and with it every balance that once limited power. Narmer now stood alone at the top. No rivals, no equals, only subordinates. And history teaches us something dangerous. When violence creates a state, violence remains its language. The wars were over, but the threat had only moved from the battlefield to the palace. With his enemies destroyed, Narmer became something no ruler before him had ever been. Not just a king, a pharaoh. For the first time, political power and divine authority merged into one body. Narmer was no longer just ruling Egypt. He was Egypt. The land, the people, the gods all flowed through him. This idea was revolutionary and terrifying, because divinity does not allow disagreement. Priests now served the throne, not the other way around. Generals obeyed, but no longer advised. Local elites survived only by submission. Order had been restored, but it was fragile. Behind the rituals and ceremonies, fear replaced loyalty. Narmer had erased every rival, but he could not erase memory. The old world still lived in whispers, in families stripped of power, in priests who remembered when kings were human. And history shows a brutal pattern. The first ruler of a new system is always the most exposed. There are no traditions to protect him, no rules to restrain ambition, no limits on betrayal. Narmer ruled as a god, but gods, when they walk among men, are always in danger, because eventually someone decides to test whether they bleed. For a man who created Egypt, Narmer's death is strangely quiet. There is no heroic final battle, no detailed funeral inscription, no confirmed royal tomb bearing his name. Instead, there is silence. Later Egyptian traditions mention Menes, the founder, only briefly, and when they do speak of his end, the story is unsettling. One legend claims he was killed by a hippopotamus. At first, it sounds absurd, almost mocking. But in ancient Egypt, animals were never just animals. The hippopotamus symbolized chaos, destruction, and uncontrolled power. It was linked to the god Seth, the eternal enemy of order. So historians ask a dangerous question. Was this a literal story or a coded confession? A way of saying the founder was destroyed by the very chaos he tried to suppress. Other clues deepen the mystery. Narmer's name slowly disappears from later royal records. Menes becomes a title, not a person. The founder turns into a legend rather than a man. This is not accidental. In moments of unstable succession, ancient states often erased inconvenient truths to protect the system. If Narmer was assassinated by elites, priests, or rivals hiding in his own court, the safest move was silence. No martyr, no revenge, no questions. Just a myth. Because admitting that the first pharaoh was murdered would reveal a terrifying truth. The Egyptian state was born strong, but never safe. If Narmer truly died violently, the question isn't who killed him, it's why history protected his killers. The new Egyptian state was fragile, unification was recent, loyalty was uncertain. Revealing an assassination at the very top would have invited rebellion, revenge, and civil war. So the solution was simple and ruthless. Preserve the achievement, erase the man. Narmer became Menes. Menes became a symbol, and the symbol replaced the human being. Details vanished, dates blurred, the founder dissolved into legend. This wasn't failure, it was strategy. From this moment on, Egypt would master historical control. Pharaohs would rewrite records, defeated rivals would lose their names, uncomfortable truths would disappear from stone. Not to deceive the people, but to protect order. Narmer's legacy lived on in every pharaoh who followed him, in every crown, in every claim of divine rule. But the man himself, he was buried somewhere deeper than any tomb, buried inside the story Egypt needed to survive.
Egypt remembers Narmer as a founder, but history whispers something darker. He unified the two lands. He created the crown, the throne, the idea of divine rule. And then he disappeared. Whether he was assassinated in his own palace, erased by fearful elites, or symbolically destroyed through myth, Narmer became the first price Egypt ever paid for unity, the first sacrifice of the state. His death taught Egypt a lesson it would never forget. Power must appear eternal, even if the men who hold it are not. That is why later pharaohs ruled as gods. That is why rebellion was erased, not recorded. That is why truth was carved selectively into stone. Because Egypt did not survive for 3,000 years by telling the whole story. It survived by controlling it, and somewhere beneath the myths, beneath the crowns, beneath the silence, lies the fate of the man who built it all, the first pharaoh, the king who united Egypt and paid with his life. Do you believe Narmer was assassinated to protect the newborn Egyptian state, Or did myth deliberately erase a truth too dangerous to remember? Let me know your theory in the comments.